The sun in the Texas Panhandle doesn't just shine, it hammers. When they packed the red, iron-rich dirt around Abigail Lawson's neck, the town preacher called it God's righteous justice for a barren womb. They left her there, a living headstone in the parched alkali flats, waiting for the coyotes, the buzzards, or the merciless dehydration to claim her. She was 24, condemned by a husband who demanded an heir and a superstitious town that thrived on cruelty. But the western desert is vast, and fate doesn't always take its orders from preachers. This is the story of a woman buried alive, the widowed rancher who defied a town to dig her out, and the brutal, beautiful reckoning that followed. The soil was warm at first, almost like a heavy quilt, before it settled into a suffocating vice. Abigail Lawson could only move her eyes. Her chin rested mere inches above the jagged crust of the Texas earth, the rough edge of a buried stone pressing cruelly into her collarbone. Every time she tried to draw a breath, the packed dirt pushed back against her ribs, demanding she take smaller, shallower gasps. A single bead of sweat traced a stinging path down her forehead, over the bridge of her nose, and hung agonizingly from her cracked upper lip. She couldn't wipe it away. Her hands were bound behind her back, buried 3 feet deep in the dark. Above her, the sky was a vast, indifferent dome of blinding azure. There were no clouds to offer a passing shadow, only the relentless glare of the midday sun baking her skin. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return, preacher Ezekiel Miller had intoned just hours ago, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He had held his leather-bound Bible like a weapon. A woman who cannot bear fruit is a withered branch, a curse upon the harvest, a blight upon the man who houses her. We return the barren to the barren earth. Abigail closed her eyes, the memory of her husband's face flashing against the darkness of her eyelids. Josiah Lawson. 5 years she had shared his bed, scrubbed his floors, and endured his heavy-handed temper. 5 years of watching the moon cycle, praying for a missed month, only to find the sheets stained and Josiah's eyes darkening with a familiar, terrifying rage. It hadn't started with the preacher. It had started with Beatrice, Josiah's mother. The old woman had sat in the corner of their cabin like a brooding vulture, knitting baby clothes that were never filled, whispering poison into her son's ear. She's unnatural, Josiah. A hollow vessel. Look at the crops failing since the day you brought her here. She carries a blight. In the isolated settlement of Red Rock Creek, paranoia was a contagion faster than cholera. When the spring rains failed and the cattle began dropping from the heat, the town needed a scapegoat. Josiah, desperate to save face among the men and tired of a wife who couldn't give him sons, offered her up. They hadn't even bothered with a proper trial, just a midnight gathering by the flickering light of pitch torches, a chorus of angry voices, and the horrific march out to the salt flats. Josiah had thrown the first spade of dirt. That was the detail that broke her heart. Before the terror set in, he hadn't looked at her. He just dug the shovel into the mound and tossed the heavy clods against her shins, her waist, her chest, burying the woman he had sworn to love and protect. A large black ant crawled over her cheekbone, dragging her sharply back to the present. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, twisting her jaw to dislodge the insect. It bit her, a sharp prick of fire near her temple, before scurrying into her tangled brown hair. Panic, dark and primal, clawed at her throat. She thrashed, or tried to, but the earth was unyielding. The movement only compacted the soil tighter around her lungs. I am going to die here, she thought, the realization settling over her like winter frost, despite the blistering heat. I am going to die of thirst, and then the birds will come. High above, catching the thermals, a black speck began a lazy, spiraling descent. A turkey vulture. It had spotted her. Abigail opened her cracked lips, trying to scream, to curse Josiah, to beg God for a swift end, but all that came out was a dry, raspy hiss. The moisture had long since left her throat. Her vision began to swim, the edges of the desert turning a bruised, fuzzy purple. The silence of the plains was absolute, save for the wind whistling through the dry scrub brush and the buzzing of a fly circling her ear. She let her head fall back as far as the dirt allowed, exposing her throat to the sun. She thought of the child she had never had, the phantom cries she used to hear in the dead of night. If there was a heaven, perhaps there was a baby waiting for her there. The vulture dropped lower, its red, featherless head visible now. It landed with a heavy flutter of dusty wings on a dead mesquite branch 50 yards away, folding its wings and settling in to watch. It knew the rules of the desert. It only had to wait. Abigail's eyes fluttered shut. The purple haze overtook her vision, pulling her down into a merciful, velvet darkness. Silas Hayes did not believe in ghosts, but he lived with one every day. He rode his dun gelding, a sturdy horse named Copper, along the southern ridge of his property line. Silas was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited, tall, lean, and weathered, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a jawline hidden beneath a scruff of dark, untrimmed beard. He rode with the easy, rolling slump of a man who spent more time in the saddle than in a chair. 2 years ago, this ranch had been full of noise, the clatter of pots, the humming of a woman hanging laundry, the frantic, joyful barking of a hound. Now, there was only the wind. His wife, Martha, had died in the small bedroom of their cabin, her life bleeding out into the mattress, along with the stillborn son they had already named Samuel. Since that day, Silas had turned his back on Red Rock Creek. He bought his supplies in bulk twice a year from a traveling mercantile wagon and threatened anyone from the town who crossed his fence line with a Winchester rifle. The town thought him mad with grief. Silas just thought them hypocrites and fools. He pulled back on the reins, bringing Copper to a halt on the crest of a low, rocky bluff. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a tin canteen, and took a slow, measured pull of the lukewarm water. Wiping his mouth with the back of a leather-gloved hand, his sharp eyes scanned the horizon. That was when he saw them. 3 buzzards were circling tight and low over the basin known as the Devil's Anvil, a stretch of cracked white alkali flat just beyond his property line. Silas frowned. It was a bad spot for a cow to wander into. No water, no grazing. If a calf had broken a leg out there, he needed to put it out of its misery and salvage the meat if the heat hadn't spoiled it yet. He clicked his tongue, nudging Copper's flanks. "Come on, boy. Let's go see what the devils claim today." The descent into the basin was steep, the air growing noticeably hotter as they left the breeze of the ridge. The ground under the horses' hooves changed from scrubby grass to a hard, white crust that crunched like breaking bones. As he drew closer to the center of the flat, the buzzards didn't scatter. One was hopping aggressively on the ground, nearing a small mound of freshly turned red earth that stood out starkly against the white salt flat. Silas squinted, resting his hand on the stock of the rifle in his scabbard. That wasn't a cow. He spurred Copper into a sudden canter. The sound of the approaching hooves finally startled the scavengers, sending them flapping awkwardly into the air with angry shrieks. Silas yanked the reins hard, Copper kicking up a cloud of white dust as he slid to a halt. Silas froze in the saddle, his breath catching in his throat. It was a head, a woman's head, protruding from the packed dirt. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and soil, her face blistered red by the sun, her lips split and bleeding. Her eyes were closed, her head lolling to the side at a sickening angle. "Dear God Almighty," Silas breathed. He swung down from the saddle before Copper had completely stopped moving. He hit the ground running, dropping to his knees beside the woman. "Ma'am? Ma'am?" There was no response. He peeled off his heavy leather glove and pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat, right below her jawline. The skin was burning hot to the touch, like a cast-iron stove left in the sun. For a terrifying second, he felt nothing. Then, a pulse. Faint, erratic, and terrifyingly weak. Alive. She was still alive. Silas didn't waste time looking for a shovel. He knew he didn't have one, and riding back to the ranch would take an hour. She didn't have an hour. He drew the heavy Bowie knife from the sheath at his belt and plunged it into the earth beside her shoulder. The ground had baked as hard as adobe brick. The knife scraped and sparked against hidden stones. "Hold on now," Silas muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He used the blade to break the crust, then dropped the knife and started digging with his bare hands. The dirt tore at his fingernails, scraping his knuckles raw, but he didn't stop. He scooped away handfuls of the heavy red soil, working frantically to expose her shoulders. As the pressure on her chest lessened, Abigail let out a ragged, gasping wheeze. Her chest heaved, pulling in a desperate lungful of air, and her eyes flew open. They were wild, bloodshot, and filled with a terror so profound it made Silas's chest ache. She looked at him, but didn't see him. "No," she croaked, the sound barely audible over the wind. "Josiah, please." Silas stopped for a fraction of a second. The name Josiah, registering in his mind. He knew Josiah Lawson, a loud-mouthed, swaggering farmer from town. "I ain't Josiah," Silas said, keeping his voice as low and steady as he could while he continued to tear at the earth around her ribs. "My name is Silas Hayes. I'm digging you out. You hear me? You're going to be all right." Abigail weakly shook her head, delirious. The preacher said, "Return to the dust." "The preacher can go straight to hell," Silas growled, wedging his hands beneath her armpits. The earth was still packed tight around her waist and legs. He pulled, gently at first, then harder. She cried out in pain, a terrible, dry sob. "I'm sorry. I have to hurt you to get you out," Silas said, sweat pouring down his own face, stinging his eyes. He grabbed his canteen, popped the cork with his teeth, and poured a small splash of water over her cracked lips. Abigail choked, coughing weakly, but her tongue darted out to lick the moisture. The instinct to live was still there. Silas went back to digging, using a flat rock he unearthed to scrape away the soil faster. 10 minutes passed. 20. The sun beat down on his back, but he didn't stop until he reached her knees. He found her hands, bound behind her back with thick, rough twine that had bitten deep into her wrists, leaving them bloody and raw. He took his knife and sliced the twine. Abigail's arms fell limp at her sides, useless and numb. "All right," Silas breathed, wrapping his strong arms securely around her waist and shoulders. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt of exertion, Silas leaned back and hauled her upward. The earth yielded with a sickening suction sound, releasing its grip. Abigail tumbled forward into his chest, entirely dead weight. She was covered head to toe in dirt, her cheap calico dress ruined and stiff with sweat and soil. She smelled of earth, blood, and impending death. Silas caught her, gently lowering her to the ground. She was unconscious again. He didn't hesitate. He stood up, scooped her into his arms, and carried her to Copper. The horse danced nervously at the smell of blood, but Silas murmured a sharp command, steadying the animal. He hoisted Abigail up, draping her sideways across the saddle, then climbed up behind her, pulling her back against his chest so she wouldn't fall. He turned Copper toward the distant tree line that marked his ranch. He didn't know the whole story of how a woman ended up planted like a seed in the devil's anvil, but he knew one thing for certain. Whoever put her there was going to have to go through him to finish the job. The inside of Silas's cabin was cool, perpetually shadowed by the deep eaves of the porch and the thick oak trees surrounding it. To Abigail, swimming up from the murky depths of a fever dream, it felt like she had died and woken up in a cavern. She opened her eyes slowly. The blinding light of the salt flats was gone, replaced by the soft, amber glow of a kerosene lamp turned down low. She was lying on a bed, a real bed, with a feather-tick mattress that yielded to her bruised body. She was swathed in a heavy patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. A sharp, searing pain in her throat made her groan as she tried to swallow. "Don't try to talk." The voice came from the corner of the room. Deep, gravelly, but surprisingly quiet. Abigail turned her head, wincing as her neck muscles screamed in protest. Sitting in a rocking chair by the cold hearth was a man. He was whittling a piece of pine with a pocket knife, the shavings curling onto the floor. He didn't look up immediately. Panic seized her chest, tight as the earth had been. "Josiah." She scrambled backward, trying to push herself into the headboard, but her arms buckled beneath her. She let out a whimpering gasp, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Silas stopped carving. He closed the knife with a click and set it on the table. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing he was unarmed. "Easy now," he said, keeping his distance. "You're safe. You're at the Double H Ranch, about 10 miles west of where I found you." Abigail stared at him, her chest heaving. The memory of the sun, the buzzards, and the man tearing at the dirt with bleeding hands came rushing back in fractured shards. "You," she croaked. Her voice sounded like grinding stones. "The dirt. I dug you out." Silas confirmed, nodding slowly. He stood up, and Abigail flinched, shrinking back. Silas immediately stopped moving. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "I ain't going to hurt you, ma'am. I'm going to get you a cup of water, and I'm going to set it on the nightstand. Then I'm going to step back." True to his word, he walked over to a bucket, dipped a tin cup into it, and placed it on the small wooden table next to the bed. He then took 3 large steps backward. Abigail looked at the water. The thirst was an agony she couldn't ignore, stronger than her fear. She reached out with a trembling, bruised hand. Her wrists were wrapped in clean, white bandages. She noticed, with a sudden flush of heat to her cheeks, that she was wearing a clean, oversized white cotton shirt. A man's shirt. Her hands flew to the collar, pulling it tight. "My clothes. Had to cut the dress off you," Silas said, looking away, fixing his gaze on the window. "It was caked in mud and blood, and you were burning up with a fever. Had to wash the alkali dust off your skin before it blistered worse. I kept my eyes on the wall as best I could." "You're decent." Abigail gripped the cup with both hands and brought it to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank too fast, choking and coughing, which sent spikes of pain radiating through her ribs. "Slow down," Silas advised softly. "Your stomach won't hold it if you rush." She lowered the cup, panting, and looked at him properly for the first time. He looked rough, wild even, with his dark beard and hard eyes, but his demeanor was startlingly gentle. He didn't carry the arrogant swagger of Josiah, nor the self-righteous stiffness of the men in town. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a little clearer now. "Silas Hayes. This is my homestead." He finally looked back at her. "I'd ask your name, but you mumbled it quite a bit while you were burning up." "Abigail Lawson. Wife to Josiah Lawson." Abigail went rigidly still at the sound of her husband's name. The sheer terror in her eyes was all the confirmation Silas needed. "He thinks you're dead," Silas said bluntly. "Nobody buries a person up to their neck in the anvil and expects them to walk away. They left you for the vultures." "Why did you save me?" she whispered, a tear finally breaking free and tracking down her bruised cheek. She hadn't cried during the burial. She had refused to give Josiah the satisfaction. But here, in the quiet safety of this cabin, the dam began to crack. "You should have left me. I'm cursed." Silas's jaw tightened. "Who told you a fool thing like that?" "The preacher," she choked out, the shame burning her from the inside out. "My husband, the whole town. I'm Barren. 5 years. I can't give him a child. They said I was a blight on the land. That returning me to the earth was God's will to bring the rains." Silence stretched across the cabin, thick and heavy. Silas looked at the floor, his face unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was a dark, dangerous fire in his eyes that made Abigail catch her breath. But the anger wasn't directed at her. "God doesn't ask for human sacrifices to water the crops, Mrs. Lawson," Silas said, his voice a low rumble of barely contained fury. "Ignorant. Wicked men do." He walked over to the stove and picked up a bowl, bringing it back toward the bed. "I made some chicken broth. You need to eat, just a few spoonfuls. You haven't had food in at least 2 days." "2 days?" Abigail asked, stunned. "I've been asleep for 2 days? You had a fever that nearly cooked your brain. I had to pack you in wet sheets." Silas sat on the edge of the chair, holding out the bowl and a spoon. Can you feed yourself? Or do you need help? Abigail reached for the bowl, her hands shaking violently. She managed to take it, but the spoon rattled loudly against the tin sides. She forced herself to take a sip. The warm broth settled into her empty stomach, bringing a wave of exhaustion with it. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, staring into the broth. "If Josiah finds out I'm alive, if he knows you have me here, he'll kill us both. He has the whole town behind him. They're crazy with the drought. Let him come," Silas said. The calm certainty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "I ain't fond of visitors anyway." He stood up to take the empty bowl from her. As he reached out, the sleeve of his shirt rode up, and Abigail saw a small, faded ribbon tied around his wrist. It looked like something a woman would wear in her hair. She looked around the room, really looking this time. It was immaculately clean, but there were signs of a missing presence. A spinning wheel pushed into a far corner, covered in a sheet, a small collection of teacups on a shelf, untouched and gathering dust. "You live here alone," she observed quietly. "I do now," Silas replied, his tone instantly shuddering, becoming distant and cold. "My wife passed 2 winters ago. Martha, I'm sorry." Silas took the bowl and walked back to the stove, turning his back to her. "Rest now, Abigail. You're safe here. I promise you that. The ghosts in this cabin are friendly, and the monsters from town ain't stepping foot on my land." Abigail lay back against the pillows, the exhaustion pulling her under once more. She was a woman without a home, without a husband, officially dead to the world. But as she watched the broad, sturdy back of Silas Hayes, she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 long, agonizing years. She felt safe. A month bled by on the Double H Ranch, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow fading of the purple and yellow bruises on Abigail's skin. The deep, raw cuts on her wrists closed into raised, silvery scars, a permanent reminder of the twine that had bound her to the earth. Summer tightened its fiery grip on the Texas Panhandle. In Red Rock Creek, the drought worsened. The creek bed turned to cracked mud, and the townspeople, led by the fanatical preacher Miller, prayed loud, entirely convinced that the cleansing of Abigail Lawson had not been enough to appease a furious God. But on Silas's isolated homestead, a quiet, fragile peace took root. Abigail did not return to the subservient, terrified creature she had been under Josiah's roof. Silas wouldn't allow it. When she first tried to take over all the chores, scrubbing the floorboards until her knuckles bled, terrified that she had to earn her keep lest he throw her out, Silas had gently but firmly taken the lye soap from her hands. "You ain't a hired hand, and you sure as hell ain't my servant," he had told her, his voice a low rumble. "You eat when you're hungry. You rest when you're tired. The only thing you owe me is healing up." They fell into a rhythm born of mutual, unspoken grief. Abigail took over the cooking and the tending of the small, struggling vegetable patch near the well. Silas worked the cattle and mended fences. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. Silas would smoke his pipe and whittle, while Abigail mended clothes. The silence between them wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was the comfortable quiet of 2 survivors sharing a life raft. One humid evening, as the cicadas began their deafening chorus, Silas walked out to the porch carrying something wrapped in an oiled cloth. He set it on the small table between their rocking chairs and unwrapped it. It was a Colt .45 Peacemaker, its steel barrel gleaming with a fresh coat of gun oil. Abigail stopped her sewing, her eyes darting to the weapon. "What is that for?" "It's for you," Silas said. He picked it up, popped the cylinder open to show her it was empty, and handed it to her handle first. "Take it." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she grasped the heavy, cold wood of the grip. It felt massive and lethal in her small hands. "Josiah never let me near the guns. He said a woman's hands were for the cradle and the washboard. He said I was too stupid to aim straight." Silas's jaw tightened, a familiar flash of anger darkening his eyes. "Josiah is a coward who builds himself up by keeping you in the dirt. Literally." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The world is a hard place, Abigail. I won't always be standing right next to you. If a rattler gets in the coop, or a two-legged snake comes onto this porch, you need to know how to bite back. For the next week, behind the barn, Silas taught her. He showed her the stance, the way to grip the heavy iron without breaking her wrist, and how to sight down the barrel. The first time she pulled the trigger, the recoil knocked her backward into the dust. Silas hadn't laughed. He had offered her a hand up, dusted off her shoulder, and said, "Again." By the end of the month, she could hit a tin can at 20 yards. More importantly, the fearful, hollow look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. One afternoon, while searching for a lost calf near the southern ridge, Abigail stumbled upon two small, unmarked wooden crosses set beneath the shade of a twisted live oak. A border of smooth white river stones encircled the graves. Silas rode up on Copper a few minutes later. He didn't speak as he dismounted and took off his Stetson, standing beside her in the dappled shade. "Martha?" Abigail asked softly, looking at the larger cross. "And Samuel?" Silas replied, his voice thick with a sorrow that time had not eroded. "They were my whole world. When the fever took them, I thought I died too. I just forgot to stop breathing." Abigail reached out, her fingers gently brushing the rough wood of Samuel's cross. "I'm so sorry, Silas. I know what it is to grieve a child, even one that was never born. The emptiness, it echoes." Silas turned his head to look at her. The afternoon sun caught the silver scars on her wrists and the lingering shadows beneath her eyes. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her since the day he carried her into the cabin, and the tenderness of the gesture sent a sudden, warm jolt straight to Abigail's heart. "You aren't cursed, Abigail," he whispered fiercely. "Do you hear me? The only rot in Red Rock Creek is in the hearts of the men who put you in the ground. You are. You are the bravest woman I've ever known." Abigail looked up into his winter sky eyes, her breath catching in her throat. For a fleeting moment, the ghosts of their pasts retreated, leaving only the two of them standing in the Texas heat. But out in the west, peace is only ever a temporary visitor. The horizon bruised a sickly, bruised purple, before turning an ominous, suffocating yellow. The air grew still, heavy with static electricity that made the hairs on Abigail's arms stand on end. "Haboob," Silas muttered, staring out the kitchen window. A massive wall of churning red dirt was rolling across the plains, swallowing the sky. "It's a big one. We've got maybe 10 minutes before it hits. Help me batten down the barn." They rushed outside. The wind was already picking up, whipping sand into their faces like tiny, stinging needles. They corralled the frightened horses into their stalls, tied down the loose equipment, and barred the heavy wooden doors just as the first wave of the dust storm slammed into the Double H. The world outside vanished, replaced by a howling, abrasive darkness. Inside the cabin, Silas stuffed rags under the door frames and window sashes, but the fine, red alkali dust still sifted through every crack, coating the furniture and the floorboards. "We waited out," Silas yelled over the deafening roar of the wind, lighting a kerosene lamp. The flame flickered wildly in the drafts. 2 miles away, caught out in the open flatlands, a man named Jebediah Starnes was cursing his luck, and Josiah Lawson in equal measure. Jeb was a drifter, a man with a penchant for cheap whiskey and a moral compass that pointed wherever the money was. Josiah had hired him for a pittance to track stray cattle near the Hayes property line, desperate to salvage what he could of his failing herd. Blinded by the stinging dirt and terrified his horse would break a leg, Jeb stumbled blindly until the dark shape of Silas's lean-to shed materialized out of the swirling dust. He practically fell out of the saddle, dragging his terrified horse into the meager shelter. Panting, his eyes red and tearing, Jeb hunkered down against the rough-hewn wood. He was out of water, his canteen dry. Through the howling storm, he saw the faint, yellow square of light from the main cabin window, about 50 yards away. Jeb knew Silas Hayes's reputation. The man was a reclusive, violent widower who shot trespassers on sight. But thirst and desperation were powerful motivators. Keeping low, Jeb crept through the blinding storm toward the cabin, using the howling wind to mask his footsteps. He reached the porch, pressing his back against the log wall, trying to catch his breath. He peeked over the windowsill, hoping to see the layout of the room, maybe figure out a way to sneak into the kitchen and steal a canteen while Hayes was asleep. Instead, what he saw froze the blood in his veins. Silas Hayes was sitting at the wooden table, cleaning a rifle. That wasn't surprising. What made Jeb's jaw drop was the woman sitting across from him, reading a book by the lamplight. She turned her head, the light catching her profile perfectly. Jeb had stood in the crowd that midnight a month ago. He had watched Josiah Lawson throw the dirt. He remembered the woman's face, the high cheekbones, the dark brown hair, the distinct, small mole on her left jawline. It was Abigail Lawson, the dead woman, the barren curse of Red Rock Creek. Jeb scrambled backward in shock, his boot catching on a tin wash bucket left on the porch. It crashed to the wooden floorboards with a sharp, metallic clatter that somehow pierced the roaring noise of the wind. Inside the cabin, Silas's head snapped up. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the cleaning rag, racked the lever of the Winchester, and blew out the lamp in one fluid motion, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Stay down," Silas hissed to Abigail, moving toward the door like a shadow. Outside, panic seized Jeb. If Hayes caught him, he was a dead man. He abandoned all stealth, vaulted over the porch railing, and sprinted back to the lean-to. He threw himself onto his horse, kicked it brutally in the flanks, and bolted blindly into the raging dust storm just as the cabin door flew open. Silas stood on the porch, his rifle raised, squinting into the abrasive yellow fog. He saw nothing but swirling dirt, but he could hear the faint, frantic thud of receding hooves. He lowered the rifle, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. He walked back inside, closing and bolting the heavy oak door behind him. He struck a match and relit the lamp. Abigail was crouched behind the cast-iron stove, her hands gripping the Colt. 45 he had given her, her eyes wide with terror. "Who was it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas walked over to the window, staring at the rags stuffed in the frame. Someone looking for shelter, maybe, or someone looking for trouble. He turned to face her, his expression grim and hard as granite. He didn't want to lie to her. They left footprints on the porch, right by the window. Whoever it was, they were looking in. Abigail's breath hitched. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her as pale as the alkali flats. "They saw me. Josiah. He's going to know." Silas walked over to her and gently pushed the barrel of the Colt downward. He pulled her up from the floor, his hands resting heavily, reassuringly, on her shoulders. "Then let him know," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, filled with a cold, lethal promise. "We ain't hiding anymore, Abigail. If Josiah Lawson wants his wife back, he's going to have to dig through me to get her." The storm raged outside, rattling the windows. But inside the cabin, the true tempest was just beginning to brew. The ghost of Red Rock Creek had been spotted, and the reckoning was on its way. The dust storm blew itself out by midnight, leaving behind a suffocating silence and a landscape painted entirely in rust. Jebediah Starnes didn't stop riding until his exhausted horse collapsed near the outskirts of Red Rock Creek, just as the false dawn began to bleed over the eastern horizon. Covered in dirt and gasping for air, he stumbled the remaining mile into town, making straight for the Rusty Spur Saloon. Josiah Lawson was sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of cheap rye in a dark, festering mood. Across from him sat Clara Higgins, a local woman with a reputation for loose morals and a sharp tongue, whom Josiah had quietly taken up with since Abigail's burial. Jebediah burst through the swinging doors, coughing up red dirt and gasping for air. The few patrons at the bar turned to stare at the wild-eyed drifter. "Lawson," Jebediah wheezed, bracing himself against a structural pillar. "I seen her. Out by the Double H." Josiah slammed his glass down, the rye sloshing over the rim. He stood up, towering over the shorter man. "You're drunk, Jeb. Or the heat's finally cooked your brain." "Seen who?" "Your wife." Jebediah spat, wiping a muddy mixture of sweat and dust from his brow. "Abigail, she ain't dead, Josiah. She's sitting right pretty in Silas Hayes's cabin, reading a damn book by the lamplight." He dug her out. The saloon fell so quiet you could hear the tick of the clock behind the bar. Clara Higgins let out a short, incredulous laugh. But Josiah's face drained of color before flooding with a violent, mottled crimson. It wasn't relief that washed over him. It was a profound, suffocating humiliation. A man whose wife survived a town execution was a fool. A man whose wife was stolen by the town outcast was a laughingstock. "Hayes!" Josiah growled, his fists clenching until the knuckles turned stark white. "That crazy, hermit bastard. He encroaches on my land, he threatens my men, and now he steals my property." Within the hour, the news reached preacher Ezekiel Miller. The preacher arrived at the saloon like a wrathful thundercloud, his Bible clutched tightly to his chest. He saw his grip on the town's fear slipping. If a woman condemned by God and his congregation could simply be dug up and live, his authority was a hollow sham. "It is an abomination," Preacher Miller roared to the growing crowd outside the saloon. "Silas Hayes harbors a vessel of blight. He defies the righteous will of this community. We must cleanse the Double H, or the rains will never return to Red Rock Creek." By noon, a posse of 15 men, fueled by self-righteous fury and cheap whiskey, was saddled and heavily armed. 10 miles away, the atmosphere inside the Hayes cabin was entirely different. Silas knew the tracks outside his window meant war. He didn't waste time on hope. He relied on preparation. He spent the morning boarding up the lower halves of the windows with thick oak planks, leaving only narrow gaps for a rifle barrel. He brought extra ammunition up from the root cellar and laid it out on the kitchen table in neat, deadly rows. Abigail watched him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was wearing her boots and the denim trousers Silas had altered for her, the Colt, .45 heavy against her hip. "They'll come in force, Silas," she said softly, watching him slide cartridges into the side gate of his Winchester. "Josiah won't come alone. He's too much of a coward for that. He'll bring the preacher and half the town." Silas didn't look up from his work. "Let them. You can't fight 15 men." Abigail stepped forward, grabbing his forearm. Her touch was desperate, pleading. "Silas, listen to me. Saddle Copper. I can take the dun mare. We can ride west, into the New Mexico territory. We can lose them in the canyons." Silas stopped loading the rifle. He set it down gently and turned to face her. He reached out, his large, rough hands cupping her face. His thumbs gently traced the line of her cheekbones. "I spent 2 years running from ghosts, Abigail," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper. "I ain't running from flesh and blood. This is my land. And you," he paused, his winter sky eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "You are the best thing that has happened to me since the world went dark. I am not letting Josiah Lawson or anyone else put you back in the dirt." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming love. She leaned up, pressing her lips to his. It was a desperate, bruising kiss, tasting of salt, dust, and undeniable truth. Silas wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, holding her as if he could shield her from the entire world with his own body. When they finally broke apart, Abigail rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "All right," she whispered, her voice finding its steel. She stepped back and drew the heavy Colt from her holster, checking the cylinder just as he had taught her. If they want the Barren woman of Red Rock Creek, they're going to find out she has thorns. They sat in the dim, fortified cabin, watching the horizon through the rifle slits. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the afternoon sun began to bake the earth, a cloud of red dust appeared on the eastern ridge. The riders were coming. There were 14 of them. They rode down the slope and fanned out in a wide semicircle 50 yards from the porch, their horses stomping nervously in the heat. Josiah Lawson was front and center, sitting tall on a black gelding, a double-barreled shotgun resting across his saddle horn. Beside him was Preacher Miller, and slightly behind them, looking decidedly uneasy, was Jebediah Starnes. Silas stood up from the table. He didn't hide behind the barricaded windows. He picked up his Winchester, unbolted the heavy oak door, and stepped out onto the front porch. The sun beat down fiercely, catching the steel of his rifle. "That's close enough, Lawson." Silas's voice boomed across the dusty yard, echoing off the outbuildings. It carried the weight of absolute authority. Josiah sneered, spurring his horse a few paces forward. "I didn't come to talk to a crazy dirt farmer, Hayes. Send out my wife. You've had your fun with my stolen property, but I'm taking her back to finish what the town started." "She ain't property," Silas replied coldly, keeping the rifle leveled at Josiah's chest. "And the only thing you're taking back to town is a lead slug if you don't turn that horse around." Preacher Miller urged his pale horse forward, raising his Bible high. "Silas Hayes, you harbor a witch, a barren curse upon this land. Surrender her to the righteous judgment of God, lest you share in her eternal hellfire. Your God must be a weak, pathetic thing if he needs you to bury a woman alive to make it rain." "Ezekiel." Silas spat back. The men in the posse shifted uncomfortably. Silas Hayes wasn't cowering, and he had the high ground. "Enough of this," Josiah roared, losing his temper. He raised the shotgun. "Men, burn the damn cabin down. Shoot him if he Tetexi." The heavy oak door behind Silas creaked open wider. The entire posse froze. Out stepped Abigail. She didn't look like the broken, weeping woman they had dragged to the devil's anvil a month ago. She stood tall, her shoulders squared. In her right hand, the Colt. .45 was leveled steadily at her husband. Josiah's jaw dropped. Seeing her alive, standing defiant next to Silas, sent a shockwave of disbelief through the crowd. "Hello, Josiah," Abigail called out, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. It carried over the wind, reaching every man in the posse. "Abigail," Josiah stammered, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second before his anger returned twofold. "Put that gun down, you stupid woman, before you hurt yourself." "I'm not the one who's going to get hurt today," she replied. She took a step closer to the edge of the porch. "You told these men I was a curse. You told them I was barren, a hollow vessel causing the drought." "It's the truth," Preacher Miller shouted, pointing a trembling finger at her. 5 years and no child. It is the truth that there was no child." Abigail yelled back, her voice ringing with newfound clarity. She looked directly at the men behind her husband. "But the rot doesn't lie in my womb. It lies in Josiah." Josiah stiffened, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Shut your lying mouth. Why don't you ask Clara Higgins, Josiah?" Abigail demanded, delivering the killing blow to his pride. A collective gasp rippled through the posse. Clara Higgins was a known fixture in town. Everyone knew she had borne 3 children out of wedlock to different cowboys over the years. "I heard the whispers before you put me in the ground," Abigail continued mercilessly. "You've been warming Clara's bed for 3 years, Josiah. A woman who gets pregnant if the wind blows the wrong way. Yet, in 3 years, she hasn't given you a bastard child, has she? Because you are the hollow vessel. You are the dead branch. You blamed me so the town wouldn't find out you aren't half the man you pretend to be." The silence that followed was absolute. The men in the posse looked at Josiah, then at each other. The brutal logic of her words, combined with the town's worst-kept secret about Clara, clicked into place. The murmurs began, dark and accusing. "It's a lie!" Josiah screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he saw his control evaporating. "She's a witch! Shoot her!" He swung the shotgun up, aiming directly at Abigail. He never got to pull the trigger. Silas's Winchester cracked like a whip. The bullet shattered the wooden stock of Josiah's shotgun and tore through his right shoulder. Josiah screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony, dropping the ruined weapon as he fell backward out of the saddle, hitting the hard dirt with a heavy thud. Jebediah Starnes panicked. He drew his revolver, aiming wildly toward the porch. Abigail didn't flinch. She squeezed the trigger of her Colt. The heavy gun roared, kicking back in her hand. She didn't hit Jebediah, but the bullet blew the saddle horn off his horse. The terrified animal reared up, dumping Jebediah into the dust before bolting. "Who else?" Silas roared, jacking another round into the chamber, his eyes scanning the remaining posse members. None of the men raised their weapons. They looked at Josiah, writhing and bleeding in the dirt, clutching his shattered shoulder, humiliated and exposed. Then they looked at the preacher, who had dropped his Bible and was desperately trying to quiet his panicked horse. The fight had completely drained out of them. They had come to lynch a monster, only to find they had been following one all along. A grizzled older rancher named Miller tipped his hat to Silas. "We got no quarrel with you, Hayes, nor your woman." He looked down at Josiah in disgust. "Load 'em up, boys. We're taking the trash back to town." Two men dismounted, roughly hauling a sobbing, bleeding Josiah onto the back of a horse. Preacher Miller didn't say a word. He simply turned his horse and rode away as fast as he could, his congregation already abandoning him. Silas and Abigail stood on the porch, watching the cloud of red dust recede toward Red Rock Creek. The deafening silence of the plains returned. But this time, it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. Silas lowered the Winchester. He turned to Abigail, a slow, genuine smile breaking through his rough exterior for the first time in years. He reached out, gently taking the smoking Colt from her trembling hand and tucking it into his own belt. Then, he pulled her into his arms. Abigail buried her face in his shoulder, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shaking but gloriously, undeniably alive. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was home. The story of the woman buried alive and the widowed cowboy who dug her out became a legend, whispered around campfires from the Texas Panhandle all the way to the Arizona Territory. Josiah Lawson lost his ranch to debts and died a bitter, broken man in a saloon brawl a few years later. Preacher Miller was driven out of Red Rock Creek when the town realized blind fanaticism couldn't conjure rain. But on the Double H Ranch, the dry spell finally broke. Silas and Abigail Hayes built a life, forged in the crucible of absolute adversity. They proved that, while the desert is a brutal judge, it cannot conquer a spirit that refuses to break. The following spring, amidst the blossoming of wild bluebonnets and the return of the heavy rains, the cries of a healthy newborn baby boy finally echoed through the sturdy oak cabin, washing away the last of the ghosts forever.